Hey friends, thanks for joining us today. We have a very special guest on the line. His name is Dave Hodges, and he runs a site called thecommonsenseshow.com. Dave Hodges is an award-winning psychology, statistics, and research professor, a college basketball coach, and an all-around great guy who enjoys spreading truth about the reality we face in the United States and around the globe. Dave, thanks for joining us today.
Well, it's my pleasure to be here with you guys.
Well, we have Rory and Peter on the line as well. And Rory, I don't want to speak for you, but I would say Dave Hodges has become one of your favorite go-to article writers.
You better believe it. I have a great deal of respect for his work, and I'm very grateful to have him on with us today. I can't say enough.
Well, we have a lot of recent articles which David has written that I do want to ask him about. But before we started recording the call here, David made the comment that unfortunately all of these headlines, all of these things that we're going to talk about are true. And that kind of resonated with me, Dave, because we've recently embarked on a segment called Doomer News, in which we cover these more frightening headlines that we're seeing increasingly common, in the alternative media. A lot of frightening headlines, like your recent one, Congress moves to outlaw alternative media, and this other one, the future of mind control is here, both of which I want to talk to you about. But your comment resonated with me. These headlines are true.
I wish I didn't have to write about them. Life has been good to me. I live a comfortable life in my country home. But 10 years ago, when John McCain and the forces of the New World Order tried to force myself and 300 of my rural neighbors off our property without compensation to make way for a Canamex corridor highway in support of CAFTA, I took up the cross and I haven't stopped. And this is how I ended up where I am today. John McCain made me the broadcaster and writer that I am.
That's so interesting, Dave, because I am no fan of John McCain. And when you speak of the New World Order, Lindsey Graham on the right, John McCain on the right, so many on the left like Joe Lieberman, Nancy Pelosi on the left. There's so many, Dianne Feinstein. There's so many people that seem to be absolutely beholden to and in service of this, quote, New World Order, that it's really important to have guys like you out there freeing America one enslaved mind at a time, which is the slogan for your website. And we sure do appreciate it, because if you weren't out there covering these topics, we're not going to get these topics covered by the mainstream Mockingbird media, are we?
No. In fact, I'm going to give you an example of how bad and irresponsible the media is. Right now, as we speak, Panama is in the midst of a banking holiday. People cannot get their money out of the ATMs. They can't get their money out of the banks. And the only place that you're reading this are on sites like yours, and the mainstream media is silent on this issue.
We did post that. Did you break that, or where did we find it?
That wasn't me. Now, I actually referenced it in one sentence in an article I wrote in the Chesterton Prophecies, but I didn't get into that because I felt someone else already covered it adequately.
Yeah, and one of our commenters said, this is bogus. The people were warned about this. So I think his argument was it wasn't a banking holiday, to which I responded, if something like this happened in the United States of America, where they closed down the banks and the ATMs for any period of time, it would cause a great deal of consternation and public outcry, and rightfully so, because if this thing is essentially a banking upgrade, which I think is the argument, they should be doing it during off-banking hours. They shouldn't be closing down the banks for days and days.
Well, it is days. They're not reopening until the 1st. I went to the two primary websites in Panama for these banks, and I put their notices into Google Translator, and basically what they're saying is they shut down Thursday, and they're going to reopen sometime on the 1st of October. And this was unplanned. The way I found out about it, my broker talked to me, and he said, what do you think about what's going on in Panama? And I hadn't heard about it yet. One of his other clients had just gotten back into the country that day, and he was furious about what was going on. He's reporting that a lot of shopkeepers are shutting down, and they're guarding their stores with guns because they expected to have civil unrest.
Well,
wow.
Wow is right, because there's another article we can talk about, game over, total collapse imminent, and the Grid X exercise coming up. We want to get into that because all of these things that we're seeing in Cyprus, in Panama, in Greece. These things are essentially the model for what I think will eventually come here to our own shores. And that's why we want to rattle the cage, and we want to inform as many people as we can about tangible assets, hard assets, owning some firearms, owning some food and water, owning some food stores, owning precious metals, owning anything tangible that in the event of a false flag economic collapse or a real economic collapse, in the event of a banking holiday or other, you will be able to survive, because so many people in this country will be unable to survive because so many people are completely unprepared, Dave.
Well, there is a collapse that's coming. The banks have been preparing for it for over a year now. And I go back to last year when the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals ruled that when you deposit your money in the bank, that money belongs to the bank, and they may do with it what they will. And then you move forward and you start looking at some of the things coming out of the Bank of International Settlement, in which they most recently told the central banks around the world basically to stop loaning money. They want to cut the amount of money in circulation, amount of loans out there dramatically. Now, if I was running a bank and I knew a collapse was coming, I would want to gather all my nuts for the winter and store them, and I wouldn't want them outside my confines. Well, that's exactly what the banks are doing. And everything that we look at from the banks in terms of stealing people's homes through the MERS mortgage fraud, which is beginning to accelerate again, the fact that the Federal Reserve was spending $40 billion a month in buying home-based mortgage securities, all speaks to the fact that the banks are gearing up for the collapse. And then we go back to April, when Goldman Sachs had their brokers get their clients to sell their gold short, and then the globalists turn right around and snatch up the gold at bargain basement prices. So when you look at that, you're saying, well, what are they preparing for? And then you look at what's going on today in the country with regard to DHS and FEMA. There are no less than 8 disaster drills planned between the period of time which started September 25th and goes through November the 13th. I suspect within one of these drills, we will see a false flag drill, because it follows the old familiar pattern of having a drill and then having the event within the drill, 9/11, the 7/7 bombings, the Boston Marathon bombing, and so forth. Right. So this is what I think is coming, guys. I don't think we're going to wait long to see some dramatic shifts in our country.
That's right. Well, to that end, Dave, I want to talk just a little bit about this grid exercise coming up, because as you and I and Rory and Peter all know, Janet Napolitano has been, beating her little propaganda drum, saying that it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when the grid goes down. There's a 100% chance that the grid will go down, be it from a cyber attack or some other event causing the grid to go down for at least some period of time in this country. And I think it's frightening that somebody who is a New World Order servant like Janet Napolitano would use the language 100% chance. It's a certainty. It's just a matter of when, not if, the grid goes down. So I think it ties into what you're saying about the grid X exercise or false flag events here in the future ready to unfold, that the powers that be will likely take the grid down, put Americans on their knees overnight, and then they can have their way with us. Because without power, without energy, without lights, without refrigerators, without the internet, we're serfs again. We're doomed. How do we fight this thing if they take the grid down for any period of time?
Well, it's a good question in terms of how we fight it. We pushed back the war with Syria, and I mean we being in the alternative media. Some of the world leaders stepped forward and said, we're not believing your false flag attacks with CIA-sponsored sarin gas run through al-Qaeda, designed to frame Assad as a pretext for going to war. And we pushed this back. My hope is, by calling attention to these events that are coming up over the next several weeks, that we can forestall the same thing. Now, are they going to give up? No. They're going to come at us with another wave of false flag attacks. But this is why I published my article. I really expect, if this grid drill does not attract more attention than is currently it's receiving, this will be the side of a false flag. But we have other possibilities. On October, I don't have the date in front of me, but I want to say October 16th and 17th and 18th and again the 23rd and 24th, there's a cyber attack drill involving 1,000 banks, and they're adding more banks by the day. Well, there's another opportunity to take it down. But my favorite here would be the Grid X drill, and let me tell you why. This has to do with Syria and Iran. The globalists that support the petrodollar need to make Iran stop selling their oil for gold to China, Russia, and India. And now Brazil is threatening to get into this game too. The petrodollar will crash. Now, the globalists are going to crash the petrodollar and the Federal Reserve note at some point, but they want to do it at a time of their choosing. Obama is under extreme pressure to get this war started in the Middle East. This is why I believe in the month of May, the globalist corporate-controlled media essentially ran 5 Watergate-type scandals on Obama in a 10-day period. That was orchestrated to get him off dead center. He wasn't able to get the job done. So they may be saying, well, maybe we can't save the petrodollar. Excuse me. So let's go ahead and collapse the whole thing. Let's go forward to the Grid X drill and see how this ties in. If you take down the power, by the third day, people are going to be rioting in the streets, they're going to have no food, and it's going to be absolute and total chaos. Within that false flag event could lie another one. The globalists, I think, may have made the decision to collapse the economy at that point by taking down the banks. And who's going to be caring about how many digits are on your computerized bank account on the third day of a blackout if you do not have food on your table? So this is what I think is a likely possibility if Obama is not able to break the quagmire and attack Syria.
I want to just say one thing about the third day theory. Sometimes my spirits are buoyed when we see a blackout happen in a major city like New York City, and over the course of a couple days, there's lots of local reports about people coming together. About people actually celebrating the collective quality of being able to have to reach out to your neighbors and light candles. Sometimes we can be surprised by these events. And then again on the East Coast, when the hurricane hit, people devastated without power for 30, 60, 90 days. And we didn't see that kind of rioting and violence. And it buoys my spirits and my hopes for humanity, because I do think that there are certain parts of this country where people will come together, and maybe the globalists will not be able to put us on our knees as much as they might hope. But then again, you can take a look at places like Chicago, Washington, D.C., Detroit, where these riots and these horrible nightmarish scenarios that you've described could certainly be happening after day 3, day 4.
Well, you make a really good point. The difference between what will happen with the grid on the 13th if they turn this into a false flag event and these isolated events like Hurricane Sandy are the fact that there was still outside help being rendered. And if we have the entire grid go down across the country, the cavalry will not come. There's no 911 to call. The police will not respond. People are totally on their own. Now, will they come together? Yes, if we can alert enough people that this could be on the way. So if the event goes ahead and comes to fruition, then people say, well, we know this is coming, and they will work together. They'll be less panicked. They'll more likely reach out to their neighbors because they've already gone through basically dismissing their own cognitive dissonance.
Yeah, it's a great point. If the whole grid goes down nationwide, that is absolutely something we've never seen before. It's really unprecedented, and it would be very, very scary. Before I throw to my trusted contributors, both of whom are intelligent guys with lots of good questions, let me just ask you this, Dave. You'd written recently about Congress's move to outlaw alternative media, and I find this very interesting that I think it's a sign of desperation of these New World Order servants, that Dianne Feinstein and Chuck Schumer, that these people would be coming together to essentially say that bloggers, alternative media sources are invalid sources, and they do not and will not and should not have the protections provided, quote-unquote, real journalists. Feinstein herself says the protections should only be applied to what she calls, quote, real reporters, and then she dismisses other reporters as, quote, basement-dwelling, pajama-clad bloggers with no professional credentials, end quote. And I think what's fascinating about that is I will hit this thing head on forever because I have a journalism degree. I went to school for exactly what I'm doing, and I will continue to speak out against the New World Order. But what do you think they're saying there? Do you think that they're saying that any alternative news source, anybody with an alternative theory on any of the things we've discussed, just simply shouldn't be heard from?
My answer is yes, and yes again, with an exclamation mark. I find that Dianne Feinstein is an interesting case in duplicity. Mm-hmm. Here's a woman who came into the Senate barely worth $1 million. Now she has estimated worth over 200 million. And the only job this woman has ever held is that of a public servant. And it's real clear the conflicts of interest she's engaged in her key positions, like on the Senate Banking Committee, that have fattened the coffers of her husband's companies. And I've documented that with the appropriate links in several articles that I've written. And this woman says that she only wants to support and have protection for, quote, the legitimate media. Would that be CNN, the news media, the communist news network, as I like to call them, that pays journalists, according to award-winning journalist Amber Lyon? They pay them to not run certain stories. They pay them to run certain stories. Is that the legitimate media that she wants to protect? Because it seems to me that's what she's talking about.
Yeah, and it just speaks to the fact that we now live in a culture where, black is white, truth are lies. It's just the whole Orwellian spectrum of nonsense. And it's very evident, I think, for anybody paying attention at all, which is all of our listeners, yours and mine, all of our readers. Anybody paying attention can see the duplicity. Anybody paying attention can see the absolute Orwellian propaganda being thrown at the American people on a daily basis. Sadly, there still are many tens of millions of Americans who are just not paying attention and don't see it. I want to toss to Rory.
Let me address that real quick. You don't gloss over that point. You just made an outstanding point there about the people that don't pay attention, because what you're almost saying between the lines are there are so many apathetic people that we may not be able to make a big enough change. And I don't mean to put words in your mouth, but that's kind of the familiar refrain that all of us in the alternative media say. But one of the courses I'm teaching this semester is a Soc 101 course. And I'm kind of dipping down here in the lower levels, but I'm enjoying the heck out of it. And let me tell you what I found about recent research in support of some of the course concepts I teach in terms of what it takes to make a big social change. And there are two major research studies on this, one in 2005, one in 2008. And what they found was that when 10% of the population holds rigidly to an idea, they are steadfast, that idea will take hold. And then the principle we call groupthink will take over with the sheep. Since about 3/4 of the country are asleep at the wheel, or as I like to say, a sheep at the wheel, they start to follow the trend because that's how they're programmed. This is how we can turn this around. If you and I can become the 10% of the country, we have the ability to turn back the globalists.
Wow, that's powerful, and I'm glad you said that. I'm glad you followed up on that, because I think that we saw evidence of it. I think we saw evidence of this sea change happening with the Ron Paul revolution, Dave. I really felt inspired by what we saw happening, and we know it's factual, it's quantifiable. We know the Mockingbird mainstream media helped steal the election from Ron Paul, helped steal the nomination from Ron Paul. I've said that if we had an honest media of, by, and for the people in this country, Ron Paul would probably be sitting in the White House instead of the current warmonger in chief. And I think the sea change is happening because I can't believe that everybody who supported Ron Paul could articulate all the things we've talked about here. Not perhaps everybody would know what a false flag operation is. Perhaps not everybody could articulate what the Federal Reserve is, who owns it, what our monetary system represents, a group of private bankers, all of that stuff. Maybe not everybody can articulate those things, and yet Ron Paul had tremendous support. He got more donations than all other Republican nominees combined from our active military men and women. I was inspired by that, and the system stole it from him. So maybe there is more of a sea change happening than we could possibly even guess at.
Well, there is, and I've talked to Jim Marrs about this a number of times, and I think he has really the most accurate perspective on this. Jim said that he really thinks about half the country has a good idea of what's going on, but most of that half, it's just easier for them to sit on their butt and think someone else is going to do it. And again, in sociology terms, we call that bystander apathy. In large groups, we tend to do a diffusion of responsibility and leave it up to our neighbor. And really, what ends up happening, what brings about social change, the tipping point, is what happens within small groups. Small groups spread virally in terms of making social change much more effectively than big groups because everyone has an active role.
Look, guys, if you're enjoying this conversation with Dave Hodges from the Common Sense Show as much as we are, show a little love and head over to thecommonsenseshow.com, where you can read Dave's articles and you can support Dave. Dave broadcasts live on RBN Sunday nights, 9 p.m. to midnight Central. And it's just so important that we all get off our duffs and support real patriots, real truth tellers, men like Dave Hodges. Dave, we sure do appreciate your time here today. What an intriguing conversation. I have to say, you're perhaps one of the more gripping guests we've ever interviewed. Rory, would you like to jump in with a question?
I would love to, and I want to start with one of my very favorite quotes. I've had this taped to my desk for years and years, and it's from Samuel Adams, and it goes along the lines with what you guys were just saying. And it's, quote, "It does not require a majority to prevail, but rather an irate, tireless minority keen to set brush fires in the people's minds." I love that. Like I said, I've had that quote taped to my desk for years and years, and live by those words, because it does not. I agree 100% with what Dave was saying about reaching that 10% threshold, and I think that once that level is breached, then the globalists are going to have a real time on their hands containing everything. I mean, it's a big. Brzezinski has already said that they're losing the battle. He said that a couple of years ago. So now where are we at? How many more people? And with the American people waking up in droves, like you said, Sean, regarding Ron Paul, and now with the Syrian war drums, I mean, what was it, 80+% of the American people standing up and saying, we don't want any more of any of this. We don't want nothing.
Yeah.
And
yeah. I was just going to say, Rory, you know what scares the hell out of me? And Dave or Peter, maybe you guys could comment on this. These people, these globalists that we've described, John Kerry, I mean, if you listen to the man talk about Syria, he comes across as unhinged. He comes across as insane. He comes across as somebody in service of perhaps the state of Israel and other special interests. He does not come across as a man who's a representative of the people of the United States. And the scariest part about it for me is that these people have their fingers on the nuclear weapons. These people appear to be so unhinged at what's happening globally with this awakening, with what appears to be happening with the demise of the dollar, that anything's possible. I wouldn't put anything past them. Lindsey Graham, we've talked about this in detail, Rory, has talked about a nuclear weapon going off on the eastern seaboard if we don't invade Syria tomorrow. Now, that doesn't sound like a prediction to me. That sounds like a threat.
Exactly.
That's what's so damn terrifying about what we face.
Well, here's what's disturbing, though. Why someone in the mainstream media doesn't have the brains to call Lindsey Graham out. Is he implying that Syria is going to launch a nuclear weapon? I mean, this is ridiculous. His story is not even plausible. He's setting the stage for a false flag attack from the missing nuke that the Alex Jones people reported on coming out of West Texas. Yeah. And I think Alex's report was credible, and Lindsey Graham is complicit in this plot, and he should be tried for treason and put in prison.
Yes.
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. It's terrifying, and when we start talking, I mean, we know that Cheney played a role in some nukes that went missing. 6 nukes that went missing. I think at least 5 or 6 of them, maybe all 6 were recovered, but a lot of the men and women involved with the missing nukes back in the Bush administration days wound up dead. So, dead men tell no tales. These people are really, truly terrifying people, because as a kid, Dave, when I was growing up, I always thought, thank God we live in a world where, I literally thought this sounds like nonsense, but I swear to God is the truth. I always thought that Bill Gates was the world's richest man. I thought that Warren Buffett was, second or first, I thought these guys were the world's richest men. And I thought, how lucky are we that that's the way things shook out, that we live in a republic, that we have a constitution, we have a Bill of Rights, that maybe by the greater grace of God, we have all of these things, and no small group controls the world because the richest guys are Warren Buffett and Bill Gates. When it couldn't be further from the truth, right? Because multi-generational banking wealth exists and lies in the domain and the hands of the Rockefellers, the Rothschilds, the Morgans, the Warburgs, and all of these international and European families and aristocracies that have their tentacles now spread far and wide across the globe in corporations, in special interests, in NGOs. And when you know that truth, it's truly terrifying because you realize that we really don't have the incubated protection of a constitutional republic. It's an illusion.
Well, not only do we have generational tyranny at the top, the minions are now intergenerational. Should we talk about the Bushes?
Yeah. Prescott Bush and rubbing
Prescott
elbows
Bush,
with the Wall Street bankers? Yeah.
Well, forget that for a second. Go back to the Nazis.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly.
You look at this, and the system is so corrupt. And I hate to say this, guys, but I've become convinced that we can't change this politically. And I'm not a violent person, but here I was talking to my news director, Andy DeRiso, about this last night. I am not one that's going to pick up a gun and get out in the street unless I'm just backed into a corner and my survival is at stake. That's just not who I am. But I will tell you this. There are people, about 3/4 of the country, that really are choosing to remain ignorant and on the sidelines. And when their safety and security is threatened and that becomes readily apparent to them, they're going to go from 0 to 60 overnight. They're not going to do a slow burn like you and I are because we know the issues and we kind of understand the pragmatics of what we're dealing with. These people are going to pick up the gun and start shooting everything in sight because they're going to be literally panicked.
Yeah, I agree with you, and I just want to share this with you. This is a quote from Woodrow Wilson, which I know you guys have all heard, but I want to share it with the audience because we are talking about it. What we just described, this multinational, this multi-generational banking wealth with the tentacles spread far and wide all across the globe, strangling the lifeblood of humanity. Woodrow Wilson talked about it, but he didn't feel like he could when he said, and I quote, "Since I entered politics, I have chiefly had men's views confided to me privately. Some of the biggest men in the U.S. in the field of commerce and manufacturing are afraid of somebody, are afraid of something. They know there is a power somewhere so organized, so subtle, so watchful, so interlocked, so complete, so pervasive, that they had better not speak above their breath when they speak in condemnation of it." And that was from his book titled The New Freedom in 1913. Now, of course, Woodrow Wilson helped these same bankers get their Federal Reserve System implemented back in the day, and maybe he lived to regret it, maybe he didn't. I don't really know, but the fact is that quote is spot on. And we're talking about it, though. Whatever he felt he couldn't talk about then, whatever the Mockingbird mainstream media wouldn't talk about or doesn't talk about today, we in the alternative media, Activist Post, Zero Hedge, the News Doctors, Dave Hodges, The Common Sense Show. Throw your favorites in there, guys. SGT Report. We are talking about it every single day in the effort to try to take humanity back. But I agree with you, Dave. I don't know that politically we're going to be able to do it because if we were, Ron Paul would be sitting in the White House.
Well, you're exactly right. And the whole system, from the Diebold machines right to the mainstream media, to the fact that the corporations get to buy the elections because people are ignorant and they vote for the familiar face, and that takes money. And you and I don't have $1 billion to give to candidates to run against Hillary Clinton in 2016. And to kind of reflect on why Wilson did what he did, he probably did what he did because he didn't want to end up like McKinley. And when you gave the Wilson quote right there, you know what I flashed on was John Kennedy's quote about the gnomes of Zurich. Mm-hmm. Same people, just different generation. Same MO, same game plan.
Yeah, and they murdered John F. Kennedy, and then they put a globalist banker to head to be a member of to sit on the Warren Commission. John J. McCloy, former president.
Chase, yeah, he was. I think he was the head of Chase Manhattan Bank too, and then of course you had the lead investigator was Alan Dulles, the guy that Kennedy fired. I mean, who were they keeping off?
Well, the Dulles brothers, yeah. Well,
Gerald
the CIA
Ford.
helped form the CIA and in the intelligence agencies. John J. McCloy was the former head of the World Bank. Yeah, you're right. Gerald Ford goes on to become president.
Well, Ford and Kennedy were big-time enemies. They used to get into shouting matches on the floor of the Senate over defense spending. So, I mean, they just stacked. The only real enemy that Kennedy did not have on that commission was a guy named Hale Box. And he questioned, 10 years after the investigation, he questioned it himself. And he and Nick Begich Sr. were going to Nick Begich's home in Alaska, where their plane mysteriously disappeared after Hale Boggs had called for a reopening of the investigation.
Yeah, it's they use murder, they use assassination as a tool. I think we've seen it recently with journalists mysteriously crashing into trees at high speed. It's a terrifying world in which we live when these people have power that goes unchecked. It goes completely unchecked by the Fourth Estate, by the Mockingbird media, and that's why we're here. Peter, did you want to jump in? Because I got to tell you, man, you're not going to get me to shut up if I don't turn it over to you right now, because I'm really enjoying this conversation.
Yeah, what I wanted to ask really piggybacks onto what we were just talking about and what you had referenced earlier with the article, Congress Moves to Outlaw Alternative Media. And my thought is the more that McCain and Feinstein and people like that push back against alternative media, they're really giving it more credibility. And it kind of reminds me of the famous Gandhi quote, the first they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they fight you, and then you win. Mm-hmm. And I'm seeing a lot of fear by them. I mean, I'm kind of honored that they see people like us as a threat.
I completely agree with you.
Well, you know what they say in the Air Force, that you know you're on target when you draw a lot of flak.
Mm-hmm.
There you go.
Yeah, no, I completely.
Yeah, they're terrified.
I completely agree with you, Peter. It looks like an act of desperation. It looks like panic. Well, I've always said, we've talked about this a lot, the genie's out of the bottle, right? If you know about the Federal Reserve System, if you know about central banking, if you know about all of this stuff, the genie's out of the bottle for you. And the powers that be can't put that genie back in the bottle, right? Once you're awake, you're awake. Once you see the man behind the curtain, you see him, right? So their magician's trick no longer works. Their bag of tricks is dwindling by the day.
The game is essentially over because I think we've reached the 10%. We're now seeking consolidation and for the sheep to follow us. But when I look at what's going on today, we've won the battle of the mind, but here's the problem. It's called 2.2 billion rounds of ammo for DHS. Even the National Weather Service is arming itself. The IRS has jumped into this in a big way. The federal agencies are preparing to go to war with the American people.
Yeah, and that's a can of worms that I almost don't even think we have time to discuss right now because it's such a giant issue. But the one thing I would say, the one hopeful thing that I take away from all of that, and I don't dispute it one bit, I mean, I know it's a fact that they are arming themselves to the teeth, is even with all the active military power in the men and women that we sent over to Iraq, they couldn't lock down Iraq, which is what, the size of maybe California? I mean, what do we have now in Iraq? We've got Baghdad, part of Baghdad. I mean, they cannot lock down this entire country, can they?
Well, according to military history, they say that you need one soldier per 50 civilians to basically guard the country. They're never going to come up with those numbers, but I hate to say it, if you can't get enough people to guard the country and conquer and occupy the country, then you start your exterminations.
Well, let me ask you this. Before we lose you, Dave, I want to talk about your article, The Future of Mind Control is Here. And you can take it where you want to, but I just want to share this with you guys and share a theory that I have. When we take a look at the Sandy Hook Elementary shooting with Adam Lanza and all of the questions surrounding what really happened that day, when we take a look at the Boston Marathon bombing and all the remaining questions that so many of us in the alternative media still have, when we take a look at the Navy Yard shooting with Aaron Alexis, right? And we all have questions about what really went down that day. What I'm wondering, Dave, and I'd like your opinion on this, is Section 501, which was added to the NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act, abolished the stipulation that the United States had to leave its propaganda just overseas. It now allows this government to actively use propaganda on its own citizens. And what is propaganda? Generally, it's a lie, right? It's spin. It's whatever they want you to believe. And given all of the questions that we have about these recent events, these shooting events, it makes me wonder if those are largely propaganda events being used on the people. Because with all the questions we have about what really happened, how do we know what really happened?
I think all these events, in some sense, you've mentioned, are false flag events, and they're easy to see through. I think the Navy shooting here recent is a different animal. And the reason I say that is because in a lot of the shootings, you see the names and the ages and bios and interviews with family members of the affected. And it's designed to drum up sympathy for gun control and so forth. That's not really happening with this Navy shooting, and I think the reason there's something more to this Navy shooting, and I don't know what it is, But I understand the names of the victims now. Some of those names are being classified. So there's a theory out there, and I don't know that I subscribe to it, that in the absence of information, people will start making things up. One theory basically says that they were moving to arrest members of the Obama administration for treason on that naval yard when this went down. And that's something that I keep hearing. It's not going away.
Yeah, and that kind of gets to the point that I was trying to make. I didn't make it all that eloquently, but the point is that if they can use propaganda now lawfully against us, and we know they already do other things unlawfully, like running guns down to Mexico, like illegally targeting constitutional groups and Tea Party members over there at the IRS. If we know Benghazi, if we know that they will actively engage in things that are unlawful, this propaganda clause in the NDAA gives them the excuse and the right to explore propaganda events. And I'm starting to wonder if some of these events aren't absolutely designed from the ground up to be just that, propaganda, which, to your point, Dave, and I'm not saying that people didn't die at the Navy base, I'm saying, how do we know who died? How do we know how many people died? How do we know who shot them? Early that day, they talked about multiple shooters. Then it was 2 shooters. Then it was 1. How do we know that all of these things aren't absolute purposeful propaganda events? I mean, how do we know any of it's true?
Well, we don't. And it reminds me of the Oklahoma City bombing when the authorities were looking for John Doe number 2 of Middle Eastern descent, and all of a sudden he disappeared from the radar. They always make these mistakes in the early days. I don't have an answer for you because I'm not on the inside, but I will tell you what I know is going on in universities, and I have firsthand eyewitness testimony that's been offered to me, like people like Paula Quinn, who's a recently retired journalism professor at Western Kentucky University, and she said there are 3 things going on in her campus that she verified before she left. Number 1, they're doing mind control experiments, and they were so disturbing, so distressing, and the electromagnetics of it was so upsetting that the senior level administration moved Dr. Pam, who was in charge of this, to a remote agricultural farm off campus because of the dangers involved. Secondly, Paula was actually teaching a class of integrity in journalism, it's kind of a joke, to people who were CIA contract agents who were foreigners, and they admitted in their countries of origin they were paid to run and not run stories. And one day in class she said, I think this is a CIA operation. One of her colleagues said the same thing, and those classes were over. She never saw those students again. This is the kind of thing that's going on our campus. Here where I live in the Phoenix area, I live north of Phoenix, Arizona State University is having a DARPA mind control program at work right now as we speak. Michael Edwards of Activist Post referred an insider to me who wanted to come on my show and tell all. Well, I had 2 conversations with him, and essentially they are experimenting on mind control electromagnetically at a distance. Now, this makes perfect sense at the Arizona State because Michael Crow, the president of Arizona State, is former CIA, and he's a current member of the Council on Foreign Relations. So he'd be a great guy to run interference. Well, make a long story short, this insider informant from Arizona State told me they were doing things like monitoring Alex Jones's every communication. And I said, every communication? He said, yes, not just on the phone, not just on his computer, but personal communications in person. And he said they're targeting many people like this, and they're also attacking certain people like this in what he called the TI program, targeted individuals. Now, the Friday before he was to come on my show, 2 days before it was to air, he called and they had gotten to him, and he was too afraid to come on the show. But these are the kind of reports that I'm receiving from people. And also at San Diego State, I found this out from a researcher named Virginia Farver, as well as the previously mentioned journalist Paula Quinn from Western Kentucky. Homeland Security is basically being the conduit for tax money to support these blackout programs. They'll list, come study Homeland Security courses at our university, but then they try to find out who are the professors, what are the course listings, when do the courses meet, and none of that information is available. So this is going on all across the country, and they're hiding these blackout programs within our university systems.
Well, that's just terrifying. And I'll tell you what, guys, we don't have guests on like Dave Hodges to scare you. We don't have guests on and discuss topics like this because we want to be viewed as doomers. We just want to wake people up, and as Dave says, we want to free America one enslaved mind at a time, because the only chance humanity has is a sea change, an awakening, a sense of personal liberty, a sense of personal sovereignty, people standing up and rejecting collectivism. It's the only thing that can save us, because if the United States of America falls into this black hole of tyranny, the entire globe will fall with it. Dave, do you have any final words for us? Because we sure did enjoy having you on.
Well, it's been my pleasure to be on, and I would tell people listening to us today, it's not up to your neighbor. When you look in the mirror, you are the resistance, and if we're not able to successfully resist, we're going to make 1984, and I'm talking about the book and George Orwell, a picnic by comparison as to what's coming.
Happy rainbows.
Yeah.
Now, I'll tell you what, and I'm going to give some advice here to everybody, alternative media and people in the audience. We have to go back and forth between these two hats. I live a normal, sane life, but I also see what's coming. And yesterday, I went to happy hour with family and friends, ex-coaches, friends of mine, and there wasn't a care in the world. And then last night I did an interview on a station in New York, and then I put on this kind of hat and said, here's what I see is going on and what we need to do. And I think it's important that people don't get so obsessed that they forget to live their lives. Totally
agree with you, 100%. I mean, we've talked about that a lot here too, David, is that, and people ask me, and I've said in past interviews, I have to compartmentalize my life to some degree because I'm raising a family. I'm a father to my kids. I'm a husband to my wife. I'm a neighbor to my friends in this area where we live. And when we talk about the majority of the people not being equipped to even discuss the things we've discussed, most of the people I know don't know the language. They don't understand these topics. They can't articulate them. And so they're ill-equipped to have a conversation about all of this scary stuff. So I'm forced to compartmentalize my life, too, so that I can function in society, because most of our society is absolutely ill-equipped to talk about these topics.
Yeah, and the other thing I'd say, too, is people try to convince their neighbors as to what's going on. You have to be opportunistic. For me, my entry into the New World Order was the land theft attempted by John McCain and his colleagues. That opened up all the other knowledge. Once I was inside that house of knowledge with property rights, then I discovered all these other things. And when we talk to people, we need to see what their hot buttons are. And then you go to their hot button and say, well, this is what these people are doing to you. And that's how you open up their minds, because you appeal to them on their personal level, not a philosophical level.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And as the chicken comes home to roost and more people are hurt and harmed by this system, they'll be sent on their own journey of awakening. And sometimes that's the only time, David, when people can wake up, is when they need to or choose to wake up. You can't force them to wake up. They have to want to wake up.
And usually they have to be pushed to wake up.
Yeah, unfortunately, very true.
I'm living proof of that.
Well, guys, if you appreciate Dave Hodges as much as we do, please bookmark his site. It's thecommonsenseshow.com. You can read all of his original material right there. You don't have to come to us to read it, but if you want to come to us to read it, you're not going to miss anything, because we post a few paragraphs of everything he writes over at SGT Report. And do tune in live Sundays from 9 p.m. to midnight Central, live on RBN. There's a link right over on Dave's site, thecommonsenseshow.com. Dave Hodges has been our guest. David, thank you so much. We sure do appreciate it.
My pleasure, and you guys at SGT keep doing the great job you're doing.
Okay. Well, we will certainly try, and my thanks to Rory and Peter for helping keep things moving every single day. What a great guest.
I knew that was going to be good. I didn't know it was going to be absolutely off the chart.
Yeah, that one needs to be listened to.
He is so good.
Yeah, he's great.
That's why I post so much of his stuff. I mean, like you said at the very beginning, it is a go-to for me. It's like, I read just about everything that he writes. I mean, it blows my mind every time, because of the way that he connects all the dots. It's incredible.